You can listen to The Front on your smart speaker every morning. To hear the latest episode, just say, "Play the news from The Australian."
From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Wednesday, August 28. 270,000 new international students will be allowed to study in Australia from next year. That's after a government overhaul of its attempt to cut overall migration numbers. Thousands of construction workers marched in rallies across the country on Tuesday. They're protesting the appointment of administrators to the under-fire CFMEU and voicing their support for ousted leader John Setka. A Queensland Supreme Court judge has dismissed defamation action brought against The Australian over our podcast Shandy's story. Justice Peter Applegarth said John Peros didn't demonstrate he'd been seriously harmed by the podcast. Peros has always denied any wrongdoing. That's today's episode. One of the biggest true crime podcasts in recent years is Shandy's Story, The Australian's investigation into the brutal 2013 murder of a young woman, Shandee Blackburn. The podcast, created by our national chief correspondent Hedley Thomas, sparked 2 commissions of inquiry into how Queensland's forensic DNA laboratory was totally failing victims of crime. But Shandy's story also triggered a defamation case brought by Shandy's ex-boyfriend, John Peros. Peros sued The Australian's parent company Nationwide News, Hedley Thomas, and Shandy's sister, Shandee Blackburn. And on Tuesday, the Queensland Supreme Court dismissed Peros's case.
I was enormously relieved, Claire, and I know that Vicky Blackburn and Shandee Blackburn, the mother and sister of Shandy, were also extremely relieved. I spoke to Vicky very soon after we got the news and she was elated, and then I spoke to Shandee and she was similarly very happy. They've been through an enormous amount of grief and stress, and then having the person whom they believe murdered their daughter and sister suing them for defamation was a very difficult pill to swallow, and hopefully this finding by Justice Applegarth will make a significant difference.
Here's a voice actor reading the words spoken in court by Justice Peter Applegarth.
The proceeding is dismissed.
The judge found John Peros had not met a crucial test for the case to proceed to a trial.
The plaintiff has not discharged his burden of proof that episode 13 caused serious harm to his reputation.
This is not a finding about who killed Shandee Blackburn. Justice Applegarth makes no comment on that. It's important to note that John Peros was acquitted by a jury of murdering Shandee. He has always denied any wrongdoing, and it's within his rights to appeal this finding to a higher court.
We've been in court, Claire, for 2 years with this case. The cost has been enormous to the newspaper and, of course, the individuals who are involved, and I'm thinking particularly of Vicky and Shandee, go through enormous worry, stress and concern. But they've been staunch, and The Australian has been very staunch too. We've had to rely on our lawyers significantly, and they've done an amazing job. But this is the cost of this kind of journalism. It's very expensive. It doesn't come easily, and we have to back ourselves and fight.
Shandee Blackburn was left to die in a gutter in the North Queensland tropical city of Mackay in February 2013. She'd been stabbed more than 20 times as she walked home from work. Shandy's ex-boyfriend John Peros was charged with murder. But in 2017, a jury acquitted him. Then the matter went to the coroner, who compelled Peros to give evidence and had access to evidence that was not presented to the jury that had acquitted Peros. That coroner, David O'Connell, in 2019 found Peros did stab Shandy to death. Peros has always denied wrongdoing, And once acquitted, Peros could not be tried again unless fresh and compelling evidence came to light. In 2021, the Australian's national chief correspondent, Hedley Thomas, came along with his podcast, Shandee's Story. This is Shandee's sister, Shandee Blackburn, speaking to Hedley Thomas in episode 13.
Am I allowed to say that? There's absolutely no doubt in our minds that John Peros is the one that killed Shandee Blackburn. 100% matter of fact, it was him.
But how could you be so sure?
Because I've seen more evidence than what was presented at the trial. We know the evidence that was ruled out before the trial. We know the evidence that hasn't been seen, and it's undeniable when you have seen all that evidence together that there is any other person responsible for this.
Then what you are saying is that he's got away with murder.
I think it's a letdown in our justice system.
I called Shandee Blackburn after Tuesday's judgment from Justice Peter Applegarth.
Mum and I have never really properly been able to grieve Shandee because we've still been fighting for justice and everything that has come along with that since. So it's a step, but there's still so much more in that whole journey of justice for Shandee that is to come.
I asked Shandee if she felt any hope that whoever killed Shandee would one day be brought to justice.
There is always hope. Getting a bit emotional because I never want to let go of the fact that there's hope, because there always is. But I think after 11 years and everything that we've been dragged through with this process, it's hard to have faith in justice and in the system. And I think it's also a little bit of you don't want to get your hopes up. You don't want to ever think about that moment that whoever did this to her will actually one day be brought to justice for what they did. It would be a really amazing thing to happen, but it's very difficult to allow ourselves to go there because of even the thought of that, because it's just such a letdown from what we've already discovered and of the system and the processes and how wrong things can go.
Peros claimed episode 13 of Shandee's Story defamed him by painting him as Shandee's murderer. The judge said John Peros's reputation had been damaged, but not by episode 13.
Had episode 13 been a standalone publication, then serious harm would be easily inferred from the gravity of the defamation and the extent of its publication. Episode 13 was not, however, a standalone publication. It was the 13th episode in a series, the first 12 episodes of which seriously injured the plaintiff's reputation. I find that listeners to the first 12 episodes were likely to conclude that the coroner's findings were right, and that the plaintiff had violently attacked Ms. Blackburn with a bladed instrument in a fast, frenzied and personal attack at around 12:15 a.m. on 9 February 2013. This conclusion is not based simply on the tendering of those earlier publications. It relies on the perceived authority of the persons who made those publications and the form of the publications as being the product of investigative journalism. That distinguishes the publication from a publication of rumours and bare allegations.
The judge said Peros's reputation had already been damaged by a coroner's finding that Peros was Shandee's killer. Justice Applegarth said the coroner's ruling, which is still live today on the Queensland Court's website, and articles about that finding, had also caused Peros's reputation serious harm long before Hedley's podcast came along. At the centre of this judgment is that issue of serious harm.
The serious harm test is a new element of defamation law in Australia. It's only come into effect in the last 2 years, and it's something that's currently being decided by the courts, being figured out as new judgments are decided on the issue.
This is John Paul Cashin, a defamation specialist and a partner at law firm Thomson Geer, which advises The Australian.
Well, it's a new test that's become part of the law of defamation in Australia in the last few years. And it's quite significant because what it does is switches the onus onto the plaintiff to prove that the publication has hurt their reputation. And what it's aimed at doing is weeding out trivial claims. We used to have an old law of triviality that was meant to weed out trivial claims, and it wasn't very effective. So they've put in a new one called the serious harm test. And it means that the plaintiff has to establish not just that it's damaged their reputation a little bit, but it must have done serious harm to their reputation. And it's starting to have an effect in knocking out some of these smaller types of claims. You know, we used to have one-star Google reviews being sued over, and the courts were getting clogged up with these sorts of cases that were seen to be not the kind of cases that really should be litigated in our court system. And so the new serious harm test is aimed at weeding out those sorts of cases.
During the hearing in the Queensland Supreme Court, a barrister for John Peros, David Helvagian, told the court episode 13 defamed Peros by suggesting the jury got it wrong and the coroner was right, that, therefore, he was a murderer. Our lawyers successfully argued that the judge should listen to episodes 1 to 12 of the podcast too, to hear our journalism in all its context. We've used a voice actor to bring you David Helvagian's words from the hearing on this question of serious harm.
Episode 13 publishes one of the most serious defamatory imputations known to society. As Your Honour knows, the crime of murder in this state carries a life sentence. It is probably society's greatest crime. To label someone the murderer of another person is just of the highest seriousness. However, to do so as part of an investigative true crime publication from a mainstream media company and from a journalist with a credible history in these matters is even more serious. Episode 13 had a far greater reach across Australia than the reporting of the coroner's finding. The other inference, clearly, is a podcast such as this would not have approximately 380,000 downloads in Australia if it wasn't credible.
The judge said when discussing costs that John Peros's case was not without merit, and he says that episodes 1 to 12 were where the serious harm to Peros's reputation occurred, as well as in other reporting. So did Peros sue on the wrong thing?
Well, the judgment is quite complicated on that issue, but the judge didn't just look at episodes 1 to 12. He also looked at the fact that the coroner several years earlier had found that he'd murdered Shandy, and then all of the associated publications around that. It was on the front page of the Courier Mail, there were news reports. And so what he found was it was episodes 1 to 12, but also all of that other reporting. So I don't think we can say based on this judgment that the result would have been any different if he'd sued over episodes 1 to 12. We just don't really know. But it's certainly not the case that Peros would have won based on this judgment if he'd sued over episodes 1 to 12 as well.
You've already heard that episode 13 contained Shandee Blackburn's candid views about who killed Shandy. Also in episode 13, Hedley Thomas discussed with Shanna and Vicky Blackburn, Shandy's mother, evidence that the coroner considered which had not been put before the jury. Evidence like CCTV showing a car similar to John's car driving near the scene of Shandy's death that night. And phone records showing John Peros's mobile phone, which was rarely turned off, had been switched off on the nights before Shandy's murder. Here's Hedley speaking to Vicky Blackburn, Shandy's mother, in episode 13.
Now, the jurors in John's murder trial didn't hear anything about John's mobile phone usage and that inactivity. But Vicky and Shanna and the cops knew it.
He went for 3 nights. He did the same thing. He turned his phone off at the same time. He tried that for 3 nights and was successful.
Here's what David Helvagian, counsel for John Peros, told the Queensland Supreme Court about that.
Vicky Blackburn, the victim's mother, insinuates that he got lucky that night. She was walking home from work. The prior night, she got picked up by her boyfriend. The insinuation is he was stalking. Now, that evidence wasn't before the jury, so it's another element that undercuts the acquittal in my submission.
Episode 13 also featured someone who listeners to Shandy's story would know well, forensic scientist Kirsty Wright, who examined why the DNA samples from Shandy's crime scene and John Perros's car yielded no useful evidence for John's trial. Kirsty's work led to stunning revelations in the podcast that Queensland's entire DNA processing system was deeply flawed. David Helvagian told the court it all added up to a strong insinuation in the episode that the coroner was right and the jury was wrong.
I really want to thank our lawyers who've done a great job. John Paul Cashin, who was the senior instructing solicitor with our barristers, Dawid Sibtain and Paula Moreau. They really got on top of the issues and ensured that no stone was left unturned in the legal arguments. And Shandee Blackburn's murder remains unsolved, and we can only hope that Queensland Police will just double their efforts to try to find her killer.
Coming up, the Reddit posts John Perros relied on. We'll be back after this break.
Just listen to this. Her ex absolutely did it.
That's a Reddit user with the handle BardGirl23 commenting in early 2022, shortly after the public release of episode 13 of the Australians podcast Shandy's Story. Someone called Blonde Arbuckle agrees.
100% he did.
And another user, Nora Ladora, says,
I'm listening now and I feel it's so clear that it was the ex. The crime was so personal and John was abusive to Shandy. It is crazy that he was acquitted.
Those posts are part of the evidence from John Perros's lawyers in his claim that Shandy's story caused serious harm to his reputation. Here's what Justice Applegarth said about those Reddit posts.
The Reddit posts do not suggest that episode 13 changed their minds from having no opinion as to who the killer was, or believing that someone else was the person responsible, to having an absolute or 100% belief that the plaintiff was responsible. One might reasonably infer that episode 13 contributed to each of the three Reddit commentators being convinced that the plaintiff was the killer. For example, 100% he did. However, it is also reasonable to infer that those listeners were at least fairly convinced of the plaintiff's responsibility, or strongly believed that he was responsible for the killing before they listened to episode 13.
Justice Applegarth also said,
the proposition that a podcast episode that accuses a person of murder and that is heard by a few 100,000 listeners does not cause serious harm to reputation is confronting. The causation issue depends, however, on all the circumstances. For example, if the claimant was a notorious murderer at the time the episode was published, serious harm would not be inferred. Some compelling direct evidence of actual harm to reputation that amounted to serious harm would be required.
And the judge said Perros's barristers said in their submissions that Perros had a reputation as a friendly, hardworking, talented boxer, but that they didn't present any evidence or witnesses on this.
None of the plaintiff's friends, work colleagues, acquaintances, or family members have said a single thing about the effect that episode 13 had upon their estimation of the plaintiff, or what their estimation of him was immediately before listening to episode 13.
Justice Applegarth concluded that
by the time episode 13 was first published, the plaintiff had a damaged reputation in the relevant sector among listeners to the podcast. He would have been viewed by listeners to be the person who killed Ms. Blackburn. They would not simply have known him to be the person who a coroner found to be Ms. Blackburn's killer. They would have formed the view, based on the evidence and arguments placed before them in the series, that the coroner's finding was correct.
You can listen to Shandy's Story now wherever you get your podcasts.